Hi there, I'm Tony Lee, and this is Hot Flasher, your daily menopause podcast that serves up fresh news, research, and wellness tips. I've built a daily news pipeline to find the latest on women's health and menopause research. Allow me to introduce my co-host Nikki, who handles the headlines. Take it away, Nikki.
Thanks, Tony. We've got a good one today. 3 things on the table. Why some women get hit so much harder by menopause symptoms than others. The surprisingly non-ridiculous case for antihistamines as a symptom tool. And a new study linking inflammation in midlife to your memory years down the road. Let's get into it. So, that first story. Women's Health covered a new finding that's been getting some attention. And for once, I think the coverage is roughly proportionate to how interesting the research actually is. The question it's trying to answer is one that comes up constantly in places like menopause. Why do 2 women the same age, going through the same hormonal transition, have completely different experiences? One is white-knuckling through 6 hot flashes a night. Another barely notices. Same drop in estrogen. Wildly different outcomes. The answer researchers have been landing on has to do with something called K and D neurons, and yes, that's a real acronym, not a typo. These are nerve cells in a part of your brain that acts like a thermostat. They sit in the hypothalamus, which is basically the region responsible for regulating body temperature, among other things. When estrogen drops, these neurons get dysregulated. They start firing erratically, and that erratic firing is what triggers the hot flash response. What this new research identified is that some women appear to have a version of this system that is more reactive than others. The neurons are more sensitive to the drop in estrogen, which means the thermostat swings harder, more firing, more frequently, more intensely. My take on this. It's a meaningful finding because it shifts the conversation away from some women just handle it better. That framing has always been frustrating because it puts the burden of suffering on the woman, like it's a resilience or attitude issue. The biology says otherwise. Some women's nervous systems are running a more reactive version of this temperature regulation circuit. That's not a character flaw, that's a mechanism. And once you have a mechanism, you have a target. The caveat worth saying out loud, this is early research. The studies that have been done on K and D neurons are relatively small. We're in the promising direction stage, not the here's what your doctor will do about it stage. But fezolinetant, a drug that specifically targets this pathway and got FDA approval in 2023, is already being used in clinical practice for women who can't or don't want to use hormone therapy. So the mechanism isn't theoretical. There are already treatments built on it. This research helps explain why those treatments work for some women more dramatically than others. The antihistamine piece from The Guardian is one of those stories that sounds weirder than it is once you understand the biology behind it. The claim is that antihistamines, the kind you take for allergies, might help with symptoms like hot flashes and the mood swings associated with PMDD, which stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. PMDD is the more severe form of PMS, and it's more common in women who also have difficult menopause transitions, which is an overlap that researchers are paying more attention to now. Here's the connection. Histamine, the chemical antihistamines block, doesn't just cause sneezing and watery eyes. It's also a signaling molecule in the brain. It interacts with the same hypothalamic pathways involved in temperature regulation and mood. Estrogen actually affects how histamine is processed in the body. When estrogen drops, histamine activity can spike. And histamine interacts with the neurotransmitter systems, serotonin, dopamine, that regulate mood. So the idea is, if histamine is part of what's going haywire, blocking it might take some of the edge off. Is the evidence strong enough to go take a Zyrtec and call it a treatment plan? No. The Guardian piece is honest about that. The studies are small, Most of the research is in the PMDD space rather than menopause specifically. and we don't have large randomized trials yet. But the mechanism is real. This is not a case of someone on TikTok saying, "Try Benadryl, it cured my perimenopause." The histamine-estrogen connection is a legitimate area of research, and some researchers are now calling for proper clinical trials. What I appreciate about this story is the framing. There's a difference between "this might work" and "here's why researchers think so," and "this is the cure your doctor won't tell you about." The Guardian stayed on the right side of that line. That's worth noting because that line gets crossed constantly when it comes to menopause coverage. The practical upshot is not "go take antihistamines." It's more like, if you're someone who notices your symptoms are worse around allergy season, or worse when you're already taking something that affects histamine, that might not be a coincidence. And if you have both PMDD history and a rough menopause transition, the histamine piece might be part of your picture. Worth raising with your doctor, especially as more research comes in. The third item is a study published in the NAMS journal. That's the North American Menopause Society, and it's from the SWAN project. SWAN has been running for decades now. It follows a large, diverse group of women through midlife, which makes it one of the most valuable data sources in menopause research. This particular branch is called the SWAN HDL Ancillary Study, and it looked at whether inflammation markers measured in midlife predict cognitive function years later. The short version: yes, some of them do, and the findings are more complicated than inflammation bad. The marker that showed the clearest connection to worse outcomes is called GlycA. It's a measure of general, chronic, low-grade inflammation. Women who had higher GlycA levels at the start of the study period scored lower on working memory tests years down the line. Working memory is the kind of memory you use to hold information while you're using it, following a conversation, doing math in your head, keeping track of steps in a task. It's also one of the first things people notice slipping during perimenopause. The finding that I think is worth sitting with. It was the baseline level of GlycA that mattered, not whether it changed over time. Women who started midlife with higher chronic inflammation were at more risk, which points to midlife itself as a window that matters for brain health, not just what happens after menopause is complete. But here's where it gets more nuanced. Two other immune proteins in the study, complement C3 and C4, which are part of the immune system's basic response toolkit, told a different story. Higher baseline levels of C4 and increases in both C3 and C4 over time were actually associated with better cognitive outcomes, which complicates the all inflammation is bad framing that gets applied pretty broadly right now in wellness spaces. The researchers read is that there are different kinds of immune activity happening during the menopause transition, and they don't all point in the same direction. Some inflammatory signaling may actually be part of the brain adapting. Some of it appears harmful. The challenge is that GlycA, C3 and C4 are not things most people have measured in routine blood work. They're research tools right now, not clinical ones. So what does this actually mean if you're not in a research study? A few things. Chronic low-grade inflammation, the kind linked to poor sleep, excess weight, sedentary behaviour, alcohol, ultra-processed food, is something you have real handles on. The research on strength training and its anti-inflammatory effects is solid. The research on sleep deprivation driving inflammatory markers up is solid. None of that requires knowing your GlycA number. The levers are ones most women already know about, even if the motivation to pull them is easier when you understand what's at stake downstream. This study is the kind of evidence your doctor would look at on a tool like Open Evidence. It's from a peer-reviewed journal, from a long-running cohort study with a diverse sample. It's not a press release dressed up as research. The authors are appropriately cautious about causality. They're not saying chronic inflammation causes memory decline, just that the two are connected in ways that hold up statistically over time. That's the honest version of the finding, and it's still a meaningful one. The midlife window framing is the thing I keep coming back to. There's a tendency to treat menopause as a single event. You go through it, it's over, now you're in post-menopause. But study after study from SWAN and similar projects suggest the transition itself, the years of fluctuating and then dropping hormones, is when a lot of the downstream risk gets set. That's actually an argument for paying attention now, not waiting until symptoms are severe or until a doctor brings it up.
Thanks for listening to Hot Flasher. We're back tomorrow with more, so don't forget to subscribe. See you tomorrow.